Has someone ever pushed you into a pit? Like just full on ran up to you and just knocked you over. Probably when you were kids, if you had siblings, it might have happened to you. Different times you've been pushed in. How many of you though have been mentally or emotionally pushed into a pit? Yeah, I think most people have been there, and like at some point in our lives, we wake up and we kind of look around and we ask ourselves this question, like, how in the world am I going to get through this? How in the world is this going to turn out okay? How am I going to get through this? Sometimes life kind of disassembles piece by piece. Have you ever noticed that? Like when one thing goes wrong, you're looking for the next two things to go wrong. Ever been there? Like something breaks and you're like, oh, here it comes, and you just think like the car's going to break down or some appliance is going to go up or somebody's just going to get in a fight with you today because they just want to, right? And it's just your luck that day that's happening. But sometimes piece by piece, life begins to kind of fall apart. One thing after another doesn't really go your way. No matter which way you look, no matter how hard you dig and crawl, trying to climb out of the pit, you just can't seem to get out. And in fact, the more you try, the more you seem to bury yourself, right? And it just stinks. And you think, I'm never going to get through this. Or maybe it's more, instead of it being slowly and piece by piece, maybe it's more like getting tackled by a professional linebacker. Have you ever had that happen in your life? Where you just get slammed against the wall and you just have no idea, like it totally came out of left field. Maybe you were sitting in the waiting room and the doctor comes out from surgery and says the surgery didn't go as planned. There were complications. I'm sorry. Or maybe you open the door one evening to a stranger who hands you a certified letter and you find out that the person who made the ultimate commitment, the person who said, I do, is now saying, I don't. And they rescind their promise of till death do us part. It could happen when you go to work expecting a normal day and your supervisor calls you and says, I'm sorry. We no longer need you. Grab your things and head on home. Good luck. Or it can even happen in your own home. Verbal, emotional, physical, sexual abuse. Someone who is supposed to love you by every means of the word and all common sense ends up treating you like an animal, something to be used. Then there are those situations, too, that we also have to be honest and realize that sometimes the choices we've made have landed us in the pit, right? How many of you have made a dumb decision in your life? Okay, those of you without your hands up, you're lying in church, all right? That's not a good thing. No, we've all made dumb decisions. I think we have a level playing field on that situation. And we've all made these decisions that just weren't smart. Other times, sometimes we look back and hindsight's 20/20, right? We look back and we go, that wasn't a smart decision, but we can at least say, I made the best decision I possibly could with all the information and the knowledge that I had at that point in my life. But looking back, I kind of wish I wouldn't have made that choice. And still other times, things that happen really happen for no reason. You don't understand, and it leaves you feeling disoriented and confused, but you're still in the dark, you're still struggling, you're still wondering, how am I going to get through this? And we don't ever dream of these things, do we? We don't wake up one morning and go, man, I hope somebody or something just knocks me into a hole today. We never wake up thinking those things. They're not things that we dream about. We rarely plan for these moments to happen, and they leave us disoriented and unsure of what tomorrow really looks like. And it very much leaves us in a pit asking a question, how do I live with this? How do I work through this? How do I come back from this? All of which are simply to ask, how do I get to the other side? Is my story over? How do I get through this? We live in a culture that looks for instant answers, right? I think we do. If you're in a circle with someone who has a smartphone and somebody asks some weird random question, like, who was that actor that was in that movie? Somebody pulls out their phone and starts typing it in the magic Google machine, right? And somebody looks that up because we can't stand not knowing something, right? We can't stand that fact, like it just kind of, it moves in us. And my generation obviously is much worse in that department than some of you. But we need to know. We can't stand the unknown. Isn't that one of our greatest fears as a people? Is that when we don't know what's next, when we don't know where the next thing is coming from, when we don't see a path out, we begin to kind of wig out a little bit. We begin to struggle. We begin to get fearful. We begin to have that anxiety in us. And it's uncomfortable to not know. And that's the worst part of the pit. That's the worst part of the pit. You don't know what's next. There's no door. Worse yet, there's no window. And maybe there's just a little bit of a dot of light when you look up. But there's no ladder. There's no rope. And for some time, there seems to be a crowd at the top walking by. They look down. Oh, there's somebody down there. And they just keep on walking by. Unwilling to help. You see, that's basically where the story of Joseph really started. He was in a pit looking up at his brothers who were sharing a meal at age 17. In Genesis chapter 37, we get introduced to this guy named Joseph. Again, he's 17 years old. His dad, his name is Jacob. And as we read through the text today, you're going to see him also referred to as Israel. God changed his name in the middle of his life. But you'll see that change, and just to avoid confusion. But Joseph had 11 brothers, of which he was the second youngest. Can you imagine what life was like for him? Right? How many of you have older siblings? Did they beat up on you? Sometimes, right? Yeah. They either tried to manipulate you, or they tried to, use you, or they probably tried to beat up on you. I was the older sibling, so I know firsthand that what I tried to pull with my sister, right? And but 11 brothers and sisters, 10 of which were older than he was. But the first recorded action that we get of Joseph is a typical young sibling action. He was tattling on his older brothers to their dad. That's even worse. Yeah, it is. It's terrible. We don't know what they did. We don't really know why. But we know that when a younger sibling tells on their older siblings, it usually means that there's a fight brewing, right? Something's going to happen to young Joseph. So Genesis 37, verse 3, it says, "Now Israel," remember that's Jacob, "loved Joseph more than his other sons, because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age, and he made a robe of many colors for him." Now, we're beginning to see a family dynamic, and I want to point this out early so you can pay attention as we roll through this. But Joseph is literally, according to this, Jacob's favorite son. Like there's no argument. Remember, if you do have brothers and sisters, there was that argument from time to time. Well, you're the favorite kid, and no, you are the favorite. Remember what you got? You have that back and forth kind of a thing going on. Yeah, and so this is pointing it out that the favoritism was so obvious. It wasn't a debate. It wasn't a fight. It was just truth. And so he probably gets special treatment. When Joseph talks, dad listens. Verse 4, "When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him." Now, again, if we have siblings, there's probably a point at which you looked at your brother or sister and you said, "I hate you," right? I think we've all said that at one point, but you didn't really hate them, right? You were just really mad at them at that point. You were just frustrated over the fact of what they did, and something just really ticked you off, and you probably didn't actually hate them. But here what we see is that Joseph is getting handmade clothing. His father made him a coat of many colors. The text isn't detailed, but we can assume that the brothers, they got second and third generation clothes. They were probably holy, not holy in like the spiritual sense, but like literally have holes in them. They were probably torn. They were probably stained. They were probably well worn. They probably didn't want to wear it because, they wore it and they looked stupid in it or something, and they didn't want to have that. In other words, Joseph got designer clothes while the brothers got to shop at the thrift store. The favoritism was so evident that the brothers actually developed a hate for Joseph. So, this was a state of being. This isn't just a off-the-cuff throwing that word out. This is a state of being. There's a clear separation where they can't even bring themselves to speak to Joseph. There's clear division in this family. We see conflict beginning to brew. So moving on and starting with verse 5, it says, "Then Joseph had a dream. When he told his brothers about the dream, they hated him even more. He said to them, 'Listen to this dream I had.'" Is this a good idea? No. He says, "There we were, binding sheaves of grain in the field. Suddenly, my sheaf stood up, and your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." By the way, a sheaf, if you're unaware, is a bundle of grain stalks that have been tied together after being cut down, just so we understand kind of the image. But kind of a weird dream, right? Probably had some Mexican food the night before. I don't know. I don't know. But you can see the meaning. And as you'd expect, it doesn't go very well with it doesn't go over very well with Joseph's brothers. Verse 8 says, "Are you really going to reign over us?" the brothers asked him. "Are you really going to rule us?" So they hated him even more because of this dream and what he had said. If you have a little brother that's probably already acting entitled because daddy loves him most, this isn't something that's going to inspire camaraderie and teamwork. This isn't something that's going to bring about love. I can't imagine he was like, "Guys, I had this really weird dream last night. Someday I'm going to rule over you." Isn't that weird? That's just kind of, it doesn't really mean anything, He didn't walk up with any kind of humility. He walked up and he probably had his chest out a little bit and he's like, "Guess what I dreamed last night? You guys are going to be my slaves." You know what I mean? Kind of a thing. He's already entitled. He's already prideful. He's already got some of these things going on. "You better be nice to me or else I'm going to make your life miserable," kind of a thing. And these guys are, no way this is going to happen. It's hard to take someone seriously when they say these things and there's a good relationship, right? This just magnifies it even more when there's a bad relationship going on. So you can just imagine the situation is getting much worse. It's back to the text in verse 9. He says, "Then he had another dream and he told it to his brothers." Right? "Look," he said, "I had another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, and 11 stars." How many brothers does Joseph have? 11. 11 stars were bowing down to me. He told his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him. He said, "What kind of dream is this that you've had?" He said, "Am I and your mother and your brothers really going to come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Come on, right? Why would you go and tell your brothers? You may tell your mom and dad, but your brothers, after the reaction to the last dream, why would you do this again? Kid's not the smartest guy on the block, right? His brothers have had it at this point. So a while later, the story continues that Joseph's brothers are out in a pasture quite a ways away, and Jacob asked Joseph to go check on them. He wanted to make sure they were doing okay, and wanted a report back as to what they were doing, how they were doing, So Joseph, he heads out to find them, and in verse 18, it says that the brothers, they saw him in the distance, and before they had reached him, they plotted to kill him. They plotted to kill him. How did they see him coming? Off in a distance, right? He was wearing a fancy coat. That's a good way to put it. He was wearing a coat of many colors. This isn't something that blends in with the scenery. This is probably, we're looking at reds and blues and orange and something that stands out against the backdrop. And they saw the colored coat that represented their father's favoritism. And they started griping, "Oh, here he comes." Someone may have mentioned it half joking. We don't get the full conversation, but they may have mentioned it half joking, kind of testing the waters. We should kill him. We probably weren't that blunt, but what could we do? We could get rid of this guy. And then probably another brother spoke up and said, I'd be okay with that. And all of a sudden the groupthink kind of begins to take over. And so by the time Joseph got there, they kind of had this plan worked out, what they were going to do. They stripped him of the robe, that symbol of their father's favoritism, and they picked him up and they threw him in a pit, what was known as a cistern at the time. Now, cisterns were deep. They were jagged. The point of having a cistern is that when it would rain, it would collect the water. And it didn't rain very often. So these were valuable, but there wasn't typically water in them. And the Bible is clear on this. It wasn't water in it at the time. So there's no water and nothing to break Joseph's fall. So what'd they do then? Well, verse 25 says that the brothers sat down to eat a meal. Doesn't say why, but you can suspect, right? You can kind of maybe gather a few reasons to understand the motivation behind what was maybe going on. Maybe it was relief or even a celebration of sorts. Something that had been frustrating them for a long time. They now sat down and broke bread together to be like, we can live in peace. Away from this jealousy, away from this hatred, away from those things. And this pest, this nuisance in our lives is gone. Their plan was then to take the coat, dip it in blood, and take it back to their father and convince him that he was killed by something wild. From Joseph's point of view, this privileged life that he had, now all of a sudden he finds himself at the bottom of a pit. He's on his own now, staring up at the opening of this pit that he cannot reach. Only his brothers who hate him know he's in there. The dreams he was so excited about are now evaporating in front of his eyes. The favor he enjoyed is now nowhere to be found. And as far as he knows, this is it. Close the cover, story's over. And I have to imagine that today some of you might not be staring out of a literal pit. You might not be looking up, and you might not be stuck in something that has got you physically trapped, but emotionally or mentally, maybe even spiritually, you are low. And it is dark around you. And it feels like, to some degree, your story is over. And that's where I believe God brought you here for a purpose today. You might be in a financial pit. You might be in a relational pit. You might be in an emotional pit. You might even be in a pit that you don't even understand what it is and what's going on. You might not even be able to see the opening that you were tossed in through. And all you can see is darkness, and it's leading to hopelessness and despair. Everything you knew, everything that's familiar, every dream that you had, it's changed and it's evaporating. It's like a vapor that is just slipping through your fingers. And maybe you feel like disappearing. But here's what I want you to know today, is that God is not done writing your story. God is not done writing your story. He is still present. God is still at work. God is still sitting on the throne. He rules over the universe. Your story is not over. Now, I know the last thing you want to hear when you're in a pit is pithy sayings from people who aren't willing to climb down in the pit with you and lend you their ear or even offer a hand. There's a lot of, this is where a lot of good-natured people will come in and try to teach you about how if you become a follower of Jesus Christ, life gets rosy and the trouble that you're experiencing just kind of disappears. And all of a sudden, things just start going your way because God is now on your side. And I'm here to tell you, as someone who is a Christian, who's lived through pits even as a Christian, that's just not simply true. It's just not true. The fact is that the Bible teaches us that even if you love God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength, there will still be challenges and there will still be struggle. There will be days that are just really super ugly, days that are physically painful and emotionally intense, days that the cold, dark pit feels overwhelming. But unlike many of the people in our lives, the difference here is that the God of the universe is willing and has proven that he will climb down into the pit with you. He will be with you when you go through these troubles. And the presence of God is the most important thing that any person in the world can have in their possession. And he willingly gives it to us. Psalm 34:18 says, "The Lord is near the brokenhearted. He saves those crushed in spirit." Our God reigns. Our God cares. The Psalms talk about how the fact that you were fearfully and wonderfully made, that he knows the hairs that are on your head, that he looks after you, that he loves you, that, for God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son, that whoever would believe in him would not perish but have everlasting life. But that continues. He says that Jesus didn't come to the world to condemn the world, but to rescue it, to save it. And that is huge, because even if you're not sure God's on your side today, even if you're not sure he even exists, even if you're not sure that this whole Jesus thing is a cool thing that you really should walk into, because what's the benefit? It's God's presence that gets us through. It's God's presence that we look for. See, Max Lucado, he wrote a book that is part of the inspiration behind this teaching that we're going to be going through, continuing through the life of Joseph over the next 5 weeks. But he penned this saying that is really helpful when you're in the pit. It says this, and it's on the card that was on your seat when you came in, and it's on the screen now. It says, "You'll get through this. It won't be painless. It won't be quick. But God will use this mess for good. In the meantime, don't be foolish or naive, but don't despair either. Because with God's help, you'll get through this." I don't normally like to give away the ending to the story, because what's the fun in that, right? I don't want to ruin the ending, but today I'm going to, because Joseph's story is really inspiring, and you need to know the ending to know why you need to continue looking at this with us over the next few weeks. The story is inspiring, and the other thing about this is that the pits that I've come out of, and of the people that I've worked with through their own pits of their lives, oftentimes when we eventually get out of the pit, we look back and we can see why God took us through it in the first place. And oftentimes, like a number of people, I've asked specifically, I said, if you could go back and change that situation, if you could go back and you could avoid that somehow, would you? Overwhelming, not 100% of the time, but overwhelmingly high majority of those people would say, no, I would want to go back through that again, because it's changed me in a way that I like. It's changed me in a way that I feel I'm a better person now. I've learned some things. We may regret some of the actions that taken place through that whole thing, but we're happy on the other side of the pit because it grew us, it changed us, it helped us in some way. So, the ending of the story, instead of killing Joseph like they had planned, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, and he was taken to Egypt. So 20 years later, Joseph's still in Egypt, and his brothers have to come there because of a famine, and Egypt is the only place with food. And they're reunited. Joseph's dad is still alive. He's reunited with his father. But eventually, Jacob's dad, he passes away, and the brothers, feeling guilty for what they did, knowing that Joseph is now in a position of high rank in the nation of Egypt, they're a little bit worried for their lives because they treated him so poorly when they were young. And now that dad's gone, there's nothing protecting them. But in chapter 50, we read this. It says, "But Joseph said to them, 'Do not be afraid. am I in the place of God? And this is important. He says, you planned evil against me, but God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Therefore, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph's brothers wanted to kill him. They wanted to harm him. But God was with him, and he used that mess for good. How do you go through a 20-year storm? Right? We want answers now. How do you make it 2 decades through some of this stuff that he went through? Of being ostracized from his family, wondering if his brothers and his father were still alive. Having that hurt that could never be resolved, that there was no closure to that whole situation. How do you make it through a 20-year struggle and come out like this on the other side? He's not at all jaded. He's not closed off and hateful. And at age 17, all he could see was darkness. He was almost killed. He was thrown into a pit. Joseph was sold into slavery twice. He ended up in jail. He had so many things against him. And he never could see how it would all turn out. But 20 years go by, and he looks back and he says, it's okay. It's okay. Even though you meant this for evil, God meant this for good. God was still on the throne. He still reigned. And he brought me here. He brought me here today. And through Joseph being in Egypt, the entire nation of Israel was saved. And from the nation of Israel, from that people, the entire world was saved, because that's where Jesus' lineage traces back to. God was in control and on the throne when Joseph was on the beginning side of that storm. And please hear me today. God is on the throne in whatever you're facing today. He is on the throne in your situation. He is there. He is watching. And I've been in situations where I've looked up at the heavens and I've had my fist clenched and I'm like, why aren't you doing anything about this? And you may be in that spot today too. But God is near the brokenhearted. He saves those who are crushed in spirit. Whatever pit you're in, whatever slavery you're going through, however deep the brokenness goes, you will get through this. You will get through this. Oftentimes we avoid the pit and we do anything we can to avoid it, but so many times God refines us in the pit and turns that pit into potential and possibility. He takes us and he molds us in these things that would have never been possible, never would have happened without us landing in the pit at some point in our lives. You might not understand for a long, long time. You might not know why, but you will get through this. Isaiah 43:2, we have a promise from God. He says, I will be with you when you pass through the waters, and when you pass through the rivers, they will not overwhelm you. You will not be scorched when you walk through fire, and the flame will not burn you. With God's help, you will get through this. So if you're going through something that feels like a pit today, I want to encourage you to come back next week as we dive into the story of Joseph. There are a lot of great principles in this. But not just to hear me speak, not just to hear more teaching about this, but because as God's people, we jump in the pit with one another. We know what it's like. We know that we've been there, and we know there's a purpose for the pit. We know that there's a reason why God has ordered our circumstances to be this way, even if it's the choices that we've made to put us there, because our God is a God of redemption. He's not a God of condemnation. So even if you've made poor choices that have landed you in a really tough spot, this is why God's grace is available to you and to me today. This is why Jesus was sent to the world to climb down into our pits with us and offer us his presence, offer us his love, and offer us his redemption. The Christian faith isn't just a you and a God thing. It's a community thing where we walk with one another. as we pass through the rivers and we walk through the fires of life. God has given us the church as an encouragement in real, tangible expressions of his love. Yeah, you can sit at home and you can watch Joel Osteen on the TV, or you can pull up somebody else and you can do that church life. But there's benefit when you find a community of people who love the Lord, our God, and who will come alongside of you, who will climb down in that pit instead of just walking by and saying, hey, good luck getting out of there. They ain't perfect. They're going to hurt you from time to time. But there is value in having a community that you can lock arms with and that you can call upon for help in your times of need, because God, the power of God, flows through them. Together with God's help, united in community, you will get through this. So if you're in the pit, I want to just close by reading this together. And as we read that statement, Max Lucado's little, call it an anthem. Feel trust again in the Lord. I know it's difficult. I know it's hard, especially when you don't feel God and maybe you don't know God and maybe you've had a bad experience with God. But my prayer this week has been that you would feel the trust of the Lord today. That he would warm your heart and he would call you into his presence, because there is nothing better than being in the presence of the Lord, because it's not about what we get out of him. It's about the peace that stills our heart when we're sitting in the middle of the storm and knowing that on the other side, it's going to be okay. We've just got to get through this. We've just got to get through this. So read this with me. Trust God as you do, and that he'll bring you through to the other side. Next slide, please. All right, I'll get through this. It won't be painless. It won't be quick, but God will use this mess for good. In the meantime, I won't be foolish or naive, but I won't despair either. With God's help, I'll get through this.